bastards.
Colonel Matrix, if you kill President Velasquez, I will send her back to you. If you try anything else, I will mail her to you in pieces.
Hey, do you remember the 80s? Nah, just kidding, we're not going to do that bit again. But we are going to be talking about something straight out of the middle of that decade. In cinema, the 80s is a decade rightly associated with over-the-top action films, as well as the action movie star. Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Willis, Van Damme, Chuck Norris, and He Who Shall Not Be Named. Recently, I rewatched one of the greatest exemplars of the era, and it's one I feel never gets as much attention as it deserves, despite having the star power of Arnold during his heyday. I'm talking about 1985's Commando, produced by Joel Silver, directed by Mark L. Lester, and written by Stephen E. D'Souza. The film released at a point where Schwarzenegger had already established himself as a top-tier action star, having done 2 Conan movies from the beginning of the decade, and just 1 year after his iconic role in 1984's Terminator. The film also has a lot of other names who would become famous later, such as Alyssa Milano playing Arnold's daughter, Dan Hedaya playing the Latin American dictator, Bill Duke playing a badass as usual, and even a young Bill Paxton who had already played a bit part in Terminator. Everything comes together in an 80s blockbuster that has it all. Explosions, exotic guns that never need reloading, firing an M60 from the hip, punching guys, frontal nudity, a hero who spouts one-liners when killing people.
You remember, Sally, when I promised to kill you last?
That's right, Major. You did.
I lied.
Hell, this movie even has villains who spit one-liners.
I was afraid you'd miss me. Don't worry. You won't.
But I know what you might be thinking. Does this film also have that thinly veiled homoeroticism that was a staple of 80s action movies? Well, let me just say Commando does not disappoint in that department either.
Don't deprive yourself of some pleasure. Come on, Bennett. Let's party.
Commando opens with assassins apparently wiping out random wealthy middle-aged guys. Next we cut to Arnold, who plays John Matrix. Yes, that's his name, John Matrix. An immigrant from East Germany who somehow managed to become one of America's deadliest elite operators. In case you're wondering, Matrix was supposed to be ex-Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, better known as Delta Force, but I don't remember ever hearing it in the film. Matrix lives up on a mountain, and when he's not sawing down trees and chopping them into smaller logs, he's raising his daughter as a single father, because it was the 1980s and movie mothers were dropping like flies. After an opening credits montage and some father-teenage-daughter banter about pop music, Matrix's former commander suddenly shows up, and we're informed that the people we saw getting taken out in the beginning of the film were all from Matrix's former unit. There's concern that Matrix is next in line to be killed, so the general leaves Arnold with 2 of his best men who promptly get killed, leaving Matrix all on his own. He soon finds the attackers have made off with his daughter, and they've left a man behind to deliver an ultimatum, leading to one of the greatest exchanges in cinema history.
My people got some business with you. And if you want your kid back, then you gotta cooperate. Right?
Wrong.
Matrix pursues the kidnappers, but is soon captured and told he must help a deposed Latin American dictator overthrow the legitimate government of his country so he can return to power. His daughter is to be taken to an undisclosed hideout as leverage to make sure Matrix finishes the job. At the same time, he learns that the rogue Special Forces mercenaries helping the dictator are led by Bennett, a former member of Matrix's unit who was discharged for some kind of war crimes. They put Matrix with one of their henchmen on a plane headed for the target country, and threaten to kill his daughter if he deviates from their plan in any way. As you probably imagine, Matrix figures out a way to escape his minder, and from there he's got an 11-hour window until the plane touches down to find and rescue his daughter. Along the way, an unfortunate flight attendant played by Ray Dong Chong gets taken along for a ride at first, but then proves herself to be invaluable to Matrix's mission. Not going to spoil anything here, but all this culminates with Matrix essentially taking on an entire army by himself, and it is simultaneously ridiculous and glorious. And that's pretty much it. Bad guys kidnap badass's daughter, badass kills all of them dead while cracking jokes the whole way. It's easy to see Commando as a collection of 80s cliches, and yes, that would be an accurate assessment. But at the same time, I think a lot of modern pop culture that tries to exploit 80s nostalgia often misremembers many things about the cinema of the era. For example, many 80s homages stereotype these action films as ridiculously patriotic, if not jingoist. But this tends to miss the underlying themes in many iconic films, including Commando. Commando isn't about an American soldier heroically killing commies for Ronnie Reagan. John Matrix is an ex-operative who wants to leave his military life behind, to the point that he's retreated from society to live live a quiet life in the mountains. There's a strong implication that whatever he was doing in his last mission probably wasn't too above board. His main antagonists are a group of ex-US Special Forces operatives gone rogue. In his journey to find his daughter, Matrix is as much fighting the cops and the system as he is the terrorists. And once he has his daughter back, he basically tells his old commander that the whole US military can go eat a dick.
Just like you to start off your unit again, John. All it would take is your coming back.
This was the last time.
Not a lot of flag waving in this film. Now, when it comes to other 80s action cliches like guns that never run dry, car chases, a hero taking on an entire army by himself, cracking one-liners when murdering people, blood and gore, and whatever this is.
I don't need no gun! I'm gonna kill you now!
Yeah, Commando ticks all the boxes on the list. And you know what? That's awesome. Now, no movie is without flaws, and if I had to pick a major one in this film, it's the final confrontation between Matrix and Bennett. The interaction that precedes the fight has a little bit too much plot convenience in it for me, and as for the fight itself, it's, well, as some people say these days, low energy. Or at least it seems that way when you compare it to all the action in the earlier scenes. With all due respect for the actor Vernon Wells, he just doesn't look much like a match for Arnold in this movie. It's just hard to buy that Arnold is struggling so hard with this leather daddy with a dad body, but I'm guessing they probably didn't have the budget to get someone like Dolph Lundgren or Jean-Claude Van Damme. As for all the other flaws in this film, it's hard to call them flaws since they're so laughably entertaining. Even the obvious screw-ups are hilarious, such as when Matrix blows up these cheap, phony-looking barracks and the dummies used to simulate soldiers standing guard don't even fall down. The final shootout is filled with laugh-out-loud moments, like when Matrix looks like he's doing hedge trimming with an M60, or the way the bad guys jump around and practically do flips when they get shot. One of my favorite death reactions is this guy in a watchtower who gets shot and is like, "Okay, sorry for shooting, jeez." I'm purposely leaving out a lot of these moments just so you'll get to experience them for yourself. But in general, virtually everything that is bad in this film is the very definition of so bad it's good. From the hapless soldier's gymnastics to Bennett's outlandishly dated leather daddy costume. And speaking of funny bits, if the fictional country of Valverde sounds familiar to you, it might be because you remember it from Die Hard 2, also written by Stephen E. D'Souza, who created it as a go-to fictional Latin American country to avoid offending people from any actually existing country. And to top it all off, the film has a great soundtrack composed by the venerable James Horner. I first saw this film several years after its release when I was maybe 8 or 9, and as you can imagine, I was simply enthralled. I was raised on video games like Ikari Warriors, Operation Wolf and Operation Thunderbolt, Cabal, Contra, Midnight Resistance, and in a time before the first real video game movies, this was, in fact, like a live-action video game. Hell, many video games of the era, including some of those I just named, drew inspiration from this film and others like it. Now, when you start talking about live-action violence looking like a video game, that's typically seen as a negative thing. 80s action films like Commando are often criticized for excessive violence, and that is a valid criticism. In war films, there's been a noticeable shift from the old Hollywood depictions of war as this glorious adventure toward a far more gritty, ostensibly more realistic view that portrays war as it often is, horrifying and mentally scarring. I can appreciate the attempt as someone who has seen the effects of war firsthand and have had the honor of meeting so many others who experienced several conflicts in our lifetime. But looking at modern American society in the past 20 or so years, I see little evidence that the grittier version of war in pop culture has actually reduced the fascination with war and violence. In recent times, our streets have been filled with images of young, middle-aged, and even elderly men who never served a day in the military playing dress-up in modern tactical gear with souped-up semi-auto rifles, practically salivating at the prospect of a new American Civil War, or more accurately, what they think that Civil War will be like. Even if we exclude that as an extreme fringe phenomenon, the non-stop glorification of the military since 9/11 has continued almost unabated, despite all those horrors of war films we've had since then. The NFL has been selling merch that practically looks like military uniforms, and at the height of the coronavirus pandemic, as thousands of people were dying and hospital wards were jam-packed, our brilliant leaders responded with flyovers from the Blue Angels and the Thunderbirds. Yeah, we're led by utter morons. The point here is that Hollywood's embrace of the grittier, supposedly more realistic vision of conflict doesn't seem to have helped audiences gain a more mature, realistic understanding of war. And if we admit that, then maybe it suggests that those earlier action films aren't really responsible for society's unrealistic, romanticized view of war. And getting back to Commando, there's a certain kind of innocence to its violence, something like the way a young boy envisions combat. It's so over the top and cartoonish at points, it's really hard to take seriously. Hell, I remember watching this film of my late grandfather who parachuted into France in 1944, and I'm fairly certain that at least one point in the final shootout, he was straight up laughing at some of the ridiculous action. What is more, Commando technically isn't a war film. There's no actual war depicted on screen. If anything, it's a James Bond-style thriller with a much stronger, larger 007 as the protagonist. Most of the movie takes place in the US on the streets, and interestingly enough, it's this part of the film that I find far more suspenseful and entertaining. Matrix may be portrayed as almost superhumanly strong, but until he reaches the island for the final battle, he's thrown into a predicament where his skills can't be fully applied, and thus he's forced to use his brain as much as his brawn. Perhaps this can be chalked up to the influence of screenwriter Stephen E. D'Souza, writer of Die Hard 1 and 2. Both of those films put the hero, albeit a considerably more average than Arnold one, in an extremely difficult predicament that forced him to outsmart his enemies. An interesting thing about Commando is how little attention it seems to get despite being such an epitome of the 80s action genre, and while featuring one of said genre's biggest stars. I hear and see very few references to Commando, and I'd venture to say that in Arnold's classic filmography, it seems to have been overshadowed by films like Conan, Terminator, Predator, Total Recall, and Terminator 2. I suppose it's understandable, seeing how the film fell in between those other blockbusters. You get a sense that Arnold is more remembered when he's either playing some unique character like Conan or the cyborg Terminator, or when he's placed in a sci-fi world rather than just being a big guy who shoots a lot of people. After all, he was doing something like that in 1986's Raw Deal, and how often do you hear people talk about that movie? That being said, the film was profitable and did relatively well at the box office. It may have had a more lasting legacy overseas. While living in Russia, I learned that in 2008 they made a nearly shot-for-shot Russian remake of the film called Dien De, or D-Day in English. As you might expect, it's cringy as hell, and it contains a helping of typical Kremlin propaganda, but it's interesting to see how they adapted the original film scenes, as well as those they changed. In some ways, they made it even more ridiculous, as this clip clearly demonstrates. Oh, and as for the soundtrack, well, let's just say James Horner's legacy is secure. I mean, listen to this crap. If you know of any other foreign remakes or ripoffs of Commando, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Commando is a great time capsule of the 80s action genre, and I can't recommend it enough. For all its absurdity at times, there are some good storytelling lessons to be learned here, such as the importance of setting up and raising the stakes, creating obstacles for your protagonist, and crafting a climactic battle even if it gets a bit ridiculous. And if nothing else, it's simply fun to watch and laugh at the one-liners or the unintentionally funny parts. In short, it's classic 80s Arnold at its best. So come on, do it! Watch the film! Watch it now! It's right there! So that's another review finished. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it very informative. If you have any questions or comments or maybe your own memories about this film, by all means, leave a comment. Also, as always, I'd ask you to click like and subscribe. And also check the video description below where you can find a link to my Patreon site so you can support my work. Come on, do it! Become a patron! I'm right here! Okay, so for Spaghetti Kozak Media, I'm signing off and I'll be back, viewers.